In order to get started creating our first React component, we're going to need to import React from our React package. Now we're going to take a look at how to create a component in a couple different ways here, and the first one will be the class component. So I'm going to say class app extends react.component. So here in the extension of react.component, there's a whole bunch of things we can do, but one thing we're always going to do in a class component is have a render method that returns the DOM representation of our component. Now we're going to be using something called JSX, which is an HTML-like syntax. So here I'm outputting an H1. Inside of that, I'm just going to say hello world. And then down here at the bottom of our file, I'm going to export by default our app component, and we should see that render in the browser. Now I said JSX is HTML-like. One very simple difference between HTML and JSX is class name. So if this was HTML, we could just say class equals whatever, but since in JSX and in JavaScript, class is a reserved keyword, we need to use the alternative class name. Now all JSX gets compiled down to JavaScript, and just to take a quick peek at what that looks like, it's the react.createElement function. So the first thing that's passed into that is our element, and in this case it's an H1. One thing to mention is that all components or all custom React components need to start with a capital letter. This is a very quick check for React to decide whether this is a native HTML DOM element or a custom component. So in our case, the lowercase h plus the 1 means it's a standard H1 element. The second argument is for something called props, and the third argument can either be another element or it can be a string representing the inner HTML or text content of our element. So here we'll just say hello eggheads, save that, and you can see we get a very similar result. I'm going to go ahead and put this back to the JSX since that is what we'll be using during this series. So there is another way we can create a component, and this is called a stateless function component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new constant variable called app. It's going to be equal to a function that simply returns our JSX. And we can see that rendered there in the browser. Now the primary difference between the class component and the stateless function component is that the class component, among a few other things, can have what's called state, whereas a stateless function component cannot.